When Margaret Thornfield knocked on David Chen's cabin door at 6 a.m. with 3 men in tactical gear claiming to be federal agents, she thought she'd finally won their 2-year horror war. She had no idea the real FBI agents were already inside, recording every word through hidden microphones. What happened next would expose a conspiracy so twisted it would land her behind bars and reveal the shocking truth about who was really pulling the strings in Pinewood Estates. David Chen never imagined that buying his dream retirement cabin in the mountains of Colorado would turn into a legal nightmare that would consume 2 years of each. His life. The 62-year-old former software engineer had worked 30 years in Silicon Valley, saving every penny for this moment, a peaceful retreat in Pinewood Estates, where he could finally write the novel he'd been planning since college. But Margaret Thornfield had other plans. Margaret, the 58-year-old HOA president of Pinewood Estates, ruled the community with an iron fist that would make dictators jealous. With her perfectly coiffed silver hair and designer pantsuit that never seemed to wrinkle, she patrolled the neighborhood like a general inspecting troops. Her weapon of choice wasn't a sword. It was a thick binder of horror regulations that she'd personally authored, expanding the original 12 rules into a 247-page manifesto of micromanagement. The war began on David's 3rd day in the cabin. He'd installed a small satellite dish on his roof to get internet for his writing. Within hours, Margaret was at his door, clipboard in hand, her lips pursed in disapproval. "Mr. Chen, that satellite dish is a clear violation of Section 3B of our architectural guidelines," she announced, not bothering with pleasantries. "It disrupts the aesthetic harmony of our community." David looked at the dish, barely visible from the ground. "Mrs. Thornfield, I checked the original HOA documents before I bought. There's nothing about satellite dishes." Margaret's eyes flashed, with the kind of fury reserved for people who dared question her authority. "The original documents are outdated. We've updated our standards. The dish comes down, or you'll face fines." What David didn't know was that Margaret had been systematically rewriting the horror rules for years, transforming reasonable community guidelines into a web of impossible restrictions designed to force out residents she deemed undesirable. Her targets were always the same: new residents who hadn't been part of her inner circle, particularly those who questioned her methods. The fines started small: $50 for the satellite dish, $100 for parking his car 2 inches over the designated spot, $200 for having outdoor furniture that was hunter green instead of forest green, a distinction Margaret claimed was obvious to anyone with proper aesthetic sensibilities. David tried reasoning with her. He attended HOA meetings, where Margaret would sit at the head of a conference table like a judge, flanked by her 3-person board, all hand-picked allies who nodded at her every word. When David presented evidence that his satellite dish was legally protected under federal telecommunications law, Margaret dismissed it with a wave of her manicured hand. "Federal law doesn't supersede our community's standards, Mr. Chen. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in a less refined neighborhood." The psychological warfare escalated. Margaret would drive by David's cabin multiple times a day, taking photos with a professional camera. She hired a private investigator to monitor his visitors. When David's daughter came to visit with her children, Margaret called the county claiming there were too many vehicles and excessive noise from children playing in the yard. But Margaret's masterstroke came when she discovered David's background in cybersecurity. She began spreading rumors that he was using his technical skills to hack into neighbors' Wi-Fi networks and steal personal information. The whispers grew louder at community events, where Margaret would pull neighbors aside and share her concerns about the suspicious loner in cabin 47. The breaking point came on a frigid February morning. David woke to find his water pipes frozen, not unusual for a mountain cabin, except that his neighbor's pipes were working fine. When the plumber investigated, he discovered that someone had deliberately opened David's water main valve during the night, allowing the pipes to freeze and burst. The flooding caused $15,000 in damage. David's insurance initially refused to cover it, claiming it was intentional damage, a classification that could only have come from inside information about the sabotage. That's when David made the call that would change everything. His brother-in-law, Agent James Morrison, worked for the FBI's white-collar crime division in Denver. Over dinner, David shared the escalating harassment, the suspicious timing of the water damage, and his growing suspicion that Margaret was orchestrating a systematic campaign to force him out. James listened with the trained air of someone who'd seen financial fraud schemes before. David, what you're describing sounds like extortion. If she's deliberately causing property damage to force you to sell, that's a federal crime. And if she's using her position in the HOA to commit fraud. He paused, his expression growing serious. We should look into this. The FBI investigation began quietly. Agent Morrison couldn't work the case directly due to conflict of interest, but he passed David's information to Agent Sarah Collins, a specialist in organized fraud schemes. What Collins discovered in her preliminary investigation shocked even her seasoned team. Margaret Thornfield wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was running a sophisticated real estate manipulation scheme, using her position to force out homeowners and then facilitating below-market sales to her business partners. The water damage to David's cabin wasn't random harassment. It was the opening move in a coordinated effort to devalue his property. But as Agent Collins dug deeper into financial records and interviewed former Pinewood Estates residents, she realized Margaret wasn't working alone. Bank records showed suspicious payments flowing between Margaret's personal accounts and a shell company owned by someone much more powerful than a retired insurance adjuster playing horror dictator. The investigation was about to reveal a conspiracy that went far beyond neighborhood harassment, one that would require David to risk everything to expose the truth. On March 15th, David's phone rang at 5:47 a.m. Agent Collins' voice was tense with urgency. David, we need to talk. Now, Margaret Thornfield is planning something for tomorrow morning, and we think she's going to try to force her way into your cabin with fake law enforcement. But here's the thing, we want her to try. We're going to be ready for her. The revelation that Margaret was planning to raid his cabin with impersonators hit David like a physical blow as he sat in Agent Collins' Denver field office that afternoon, surrounded by whiteboards covered in financial charts and surveillance photos. The scope of Margaret's operation became terrifyingly clear. She's not just harassing you, David, Agent Collins explained, sliding a thick folder across the conference table. We've identified at least 12 other homeowners in Pinewood Estates who were systematically targeted, harassed, and ultimately forced to sell their properties at significant losses over the past 5 years. David flipped through the files, his hands trembling slightly as he recognized names from HOA meetings. Quiet neighbors who'd simply disappear from the community through months of escalating violations. And fines. Patricia Hendricks, the elderly widow who'd been cited for excessive bird feeding. The young family with twins who'd been forced out over noise violations from children playing. The veteran who'd been targeted for having an inappropriate flag display. Each of these properties was sold within 6 months of the harassment campaigns reaching their peak. Agent Collins continued, and in every case, the buyers were connected to the same shell company, Mountain Vista Properties, LLC. The name sent a chill down David's spine. He'd seen it before, on paperwork Margaret had helpfully provided when suggesting he might want to sell his cabin to avoid further community conflicts. Agent Morrison leaned forward, his expression grim. David, we've traced the ownership of Mountain Vista Properties through 3 layers of shell companies. The ultimate owner is someone with significant political connections in the county. Someone who's been using Margaret as a front to acquire prime mountain real estate at below market prices. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Agent Collins opened another file, revealing surveillance photos taken with telephoto lenses. Margaret meeting with 3 men in a parking lot outside Denver. Cash changing hands, documents being exchanged. These men, Collins pointed to the photos, are not law enforcement. They're private security contractors with criminal records. Marcus Webb, the leader, served 18 months for impersonating a federal officer in a previous scheme. Margaret has been paying them to pose as various agencies, EPA, Fish and Wildlife, even FBI, to intimidate homeowners into compliance. David felt his world spinning. She's been doing this for years. We believe so, but tomorrow morning, she's planning her most ambitious operation yet. Our wiretaps picked up her final planning call last night. Collins pressed play on a digital recorder. Margaret's voice filled the room, cold and calculating. Chen won't be expecting us at dawn. Marcus, you and your team will identify yourselves as FBI agents investigating cybercrime. I'll present the warrant we discussed. Once we're inside, plant the devices in his computer setup. The child pornography files should be more than enough to destroy him completely. David's face went white. She's planning to frame me. It gets worse, Agent Morrison added quietly. She's been preparing this frame job for months. Fake IP traces, manufactured evidence of dark web activity, even forged communication logs. If we hadn't intercepted this, you'd be facing federal charges that would have ruined your life, even if you were eventually cleared. The emotional weight of Margaret's betrayal crashed over David like an avalanche. This wasn't just neighborhood harassment, it was attempted destruction of his entire life, his reputation, his freedom, his future, all sacrificed to Margaret's greed and her mysterious partner's real estate scheme. But Agent Collins had a plan that would require David to show courage he wasn't sure he possessed. We want you to go back to your cabin tonight and wait for them to come. We'll have agents hidden inside and surveillance equipment recording everything. When Margaret and her fake agents attempt to enter with forged warrants and plant evidence, we'll have them dead to rights on multiple federal charges. David's voice cracked with emotion. What if something goes wrong? What if they realize it's a trap? Agent Morrison placed a reassuring hand on his brother-in-law's shoulder. David, we'll have a full surveillance team positioned around your property. Agent Collins will be inside your cabin with 2 other agents. The moment Margaret steps foot on your property with those fake officers, they'll be caught in the act of impersonating federal agents, attempted breaking and entering, conspiracy to plant evidence, and extortion. That evening, David returned to his cabin feeling like he was walking into a movie scene. FBI agents had spent the afternoon installing hidden cameras and microphones throughout his home. Agent Collins showed him the tiny devices, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for them. The most important thing, she emphasized, is to act natural when they arrive. Let Margaret do the talking. Don't confront them about being fake. We need them to commit to the impersonation fully before we reveal ourselves." As darkness fell over Pinewood Estates, David sat in his living room, ostensibly reading, but actually staring at the same page. For 20 minutes, every sound outside made his heart race. Agent Collins and her team were positioned in his basement, monitoring the situation through their equipment. At 11:47 p.m., David's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Your time is up, Chen. Tomorrow you learn what happens to people who don't respect community standards." Margaret was ready to make her move. David barely slept that night, knowing that in a few hours, the woman who'd made his life hell for 2 years would walk into the most sophisticated sting operation the FBI had ever conducted in a residential community. What none of them knew was that Margaret's mysterious partner had been watching the FBI's investigation unfold and had prepared a countermove that would turn the entire operation on its head. At 5:30 a.m., David's landline rang. Agent Collins' voice was sharp with alarm. "David, we're seeing unexpected movement. Multiple vehicles approaching from different directions. This isn't just Margaret and 3 fake officers. Someone leaked our operation." The sound of vehicles crunching on gravel outside made David's blood run cold. Margaret's voice carried through the morning air, but she wasn't alone. There were more voices, more footsteps than expected. Someone had turned the tables on the FBI's trap. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Denver buzzed with an energy that veteran court reporters said they'd never experienced. The case of United States v. Margaret Thornfield had captured national attention, not just for the audacious HOA fraud scheme, but for the shocking identity of the conspiracy's true mastermind. David Chen sat in the front row of the gallery, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he watched Margaret enter the courtroom. Gone was the imperious HOA president who'd terrorized Pinewood Estates. The woman who shuffled to the defendant's table looked decades older, her silver hair unkempt, her designer clothes replaced by an Orange County jail jumpsuit. But it was the man sitting at the prosecution table who commanded David's attention. Assistant District Attorney Thomas Brennan had become something of a celebrity prosecutor, his silver-tongued closing arguments legendary among Denver's legal community. What the packed courtroom didn't know was that Brennan harbored a secret that would explode their understanding of the entire case. Defense attorney Maria Santos approached the lectern for her opening statement, her voice steady despite the overwhelming evidence against her client. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client Margaret Thornfield is not the criminal mastermind the prosecution would have you believe. She is a victim, manipulated, coerced, and ultimately betrayed by someone she trusted implicitly." The prosecution's case seemed airtight. FBI agent Collins took the stand first, methodically presenting the evidence collected during the dawn raid that had gone so spectacularly wrong for Margaret. At approximately 6:15 a.m. on March 16th, the defendant arrived at Mr. Chen's cabin with 3 individuals impersonating federal agents. Collins testified, her voice professional and precise. She was carrying forged FBI warrants and was recorded discussing plans to plant illegal materials on Mr. Chen's computer. The jury watched, transfixed, as Collins played the audio recordings from that morning. Margaret's voice filled the courtroom. "Marcus, remember, we need those files planted in his downloads folder before we discover them. Make it look like he's been accessing this material for months." David closed his eyes, reliving the terror of that morning. He'd watched through his kitchen window as Margaret approached with 3 men in tactical gear, their fake FBI badges glinting in the sunrise. What she hadn't seen were the real FBI agents positioned throughout his property, their own cameras, rolling as Margaret committed multiple felonies in real time. But the defense had surprises of their own. Maria Santos called Margaret to the stand, and the former HOA president's testimony sent shockwaves through the courtroom. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tom told me it was all legal," he said. "We are just helping the community maintain its property values." The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison slammed his gavel repeatedly as spectators gasped and reporters frantically scribbled notes. "Tom, who was Tom?" Santos pressed forward. "Mrs. Thornfield, when you say Tom, who are you referring to?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she looked directly at the prosecution table. "Thomas Brennan, the prosecutor sitting right there. He's been my partner in this operation for 3 years." The revelation hit the courtroom like a bomb. Assistant District Attorney Thomas Brennan, the man prosecuting Margaret for conspiracy and fraud, had allegedly been her co-conspirator all along. Brennan shot to his feet, his face flushed with indignation. "Your Honor, this is a desperate attempt by the defense to create reasonable doubt through wild accusations. I've never had any relationship with the defendant beyond my professional duty to prosecute her crimes." But Margaret wasn't finished. "Tom and I have been lovers for 2 years. He's the one who identified which properties would be most valuable for development. He provided legal cover when homeowners tried to fight back. He owns Mountain Vista properties through his law firm's trust accounts." The judge called an immediate recess as chaos erupted in the courtroom. David sat stunned, watching federal agents approach the prosecution table. If Margaret was telling the truth, the prosecutor himself was the puppet master behind the entire scheme. When court resumed 3 hours later, everything had changed. Thomas Brennan was no longer at the prosecution table. He was sitting in custody, his own attorney by his side. A special prosecutor from the Colorado Attorney General's office had taken over the case. Agent Collins returned to the stand with new testimony that painted a picture of corruption that reached deep into the county's legal establishment. "Our investigation, which began this morning following Mrs. Thornfield's testimony, has uncovered evidence that Mr. Brennan used his position as assistant district attorney to obstruct investigations into HOA complaints in Pinewood Estates." The special prosecutor, Jennifer Welsh, presented bank records showing payments from Mountain Vista properties to a legal trust controlled by Brennan's law firm. Phone records revealed hundreds of calls between Brennan and Margaret over the past 2 years. Most damning of all were the recordings. Mr. Brennan was unaware that Mrs. Thornfield had been recording their conversations for months. Walsh explained to the jury she claims she was protecting herself in case their relationship soured. Instead, she inadvertently created evidence of their criminal conspiracy. The courtroom fell silent as Walsh played a recording from January. Brennan's voice, discussing which homeowners to target next. "The veteran in cabin 23 is behind on his property taxes. If we can force him out with noise violations, that lot would be perfect for the luxury development project." Margaret's voice responded, "I'll start the harassment campaign next week. How much pressure should I apply?" "Whatever it takes," Brennan replied. "These people chose to live in our community. They need to understand that there are consequences for not fitting in." David felt sick listening to the casual cruelty in their voices, the way they discussed destroying people's lives like they were planning a dinner menu. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come, as the special prosecutor prepared to present her final piece of evidence. She looked directly at the jury with the expression of someone about to detonate a nuclear bomb. "Ladies and gentlemen, What you're about to hear will fundamentally change your understanding of this case. Mr. Brennan and Mrs. Thornfield weren't just targeting random homeowners for financial gain. They were specifically targeting residents who posed a threat to a much larger conspiracy, one that involves elected officials, land developers, and a plan to illegally seize private property for a multi-billion-dollar development project. The courtroom held its collected breath as Walsh approached the evidence table. This final recording was made just 1 week before the attempted raid on Mr. Chen's cabin. In it, you'll hear Mr. Brennan discussing the real reason David Chen had to be eliminated from Pinewood Estates. She pressed play, and Thomas Brennan's voice filled the silent courtroom with words that would change everything David thought he knew about his quiet mountain sea. Immunity. The final recording played through the courthouse speakers, and every person in the room understood that they were witnessing something far bigger than a simple HOA harassment case. Thomas Brennan's voice, recorded just 1 week before the failed cabin raid, revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed David's life. Margaret Chen isn't just another stubborn homeowner. He's a cybersecurity expert who's been documenting everything. If he starts connecting the dots between our HOA operations and the county rezoning approvals, he'll uncover the entire Pinewood development project. Margaret's voice responded with chilling calculation. Then we need to eliminate him completely. Prison time for child pornography charges should keep him quiet permanently. Exactly, Brennan agreed. And once he's out of the picture, we'll have cleared the last major obstacle. Governor Mitchell's people are expecting us to deliver all 200 Pinewood properties by next summer for the resort development. The courtroom erupted. Governor Mitchell, the state's highest elected official, allegedly involved in a conspiracy to illegally seize private property. David's hands shook as the implications crashed over him. His quiet retirement cabin hadn't just been targeted for harassment. It was a crucial piece in a billion-dollar land grab involving corruption at the highest levels of Colorado government. Special Prosecutor Walsh paused the recording and addressed the jury with grave intensity. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just heard is evidence of a conspiracy that extends far beyond Mrs. Thornfield and Mr. Brennan. Federal authorities are now investigating connections between this scheme and irregularities in state environmental permits, county zoning decisions, and suspicious campaign contributions to multiple elected officials. The trial took a 3-day recess as federal investigators rested for more co-conspirators, including two county commissioners and a state environmental regulator. When proceedings resumed, Margaret Thornfield's defense strategy had completely changed. "My client will plead guilty to all charges," Maria Santos announced, in exchange for full cooperation with ongoing federal investigations into public corruption. Margaret took the stand one final time. Her testimony now focused not on defending herself, but on exposing every detail of the conspiracy that had consumed 3 years of her life. She revealed how Thomas Brennan had recruited her after her husband's death, exploiting her grief and financial insecurity to turn her into the public face of their operation. "Tom told me I was helping preserve our community," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "He convinced me that forcing out undesirable residents was protecting everyone else's property value. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. He made me feel important, powerful. I didn't realize I was just his puppet." The most damning revelation came when Margaret described the broader network of corruption. County commissioners had been paid to fast-track rezoning applications. Environmental regulators had ignored obvious violations, Even the local sheriff's department had been compromised, with deputies instructed to ignore complaints from targeted homeowners. The plan was to acquire 200 private properties in Pinewood Estates through harassment, fraud, and intimidation, Margaret testified. Once the land was consolidated under Mountain Vista Properties, it would be sold to Governor Mitchell's campaign donors for a luxury resort development worth over $2 billion. David sat in the gallery, struggling to process how his simple desire for a peaceful retirement had inadvertently uncovered the largest public corruption case in Colorado history. His expertise in cybersecurity, the very skill that had made him a target, had been the key to documenting the evidence that brought down the entire conspiracy. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, their verdict was swift and unanimous. Margaret Thornfield, guilty on all counts of conspiracy, extortion, impersonation of federal officers, and attempted evidence tampering. The judge sentenced her to 8 years in federal prison, with the possibility of reduced time for continued cooperation with ongoing investigations. But the real justice came in the weeks following the trial. Thomas Brennan, facing overwhelming evidence of his role as the conspiracy's architect, accepted a plea deal that would send him to prison for 15 years. Two county commissioners resigned in disgrace before being indicted. The state environmental regulator was arrested at his Denver office while allegedly trying to destroy documents. And then came the bombshell that nobody saw coming. 3 months after Margaret's conviction, FBI agents arrested Governor Mitchell himself on charges of conspiracy, money laundering, and abuse of office. The investigation had revealed that he'd been the ultimate beneficiary of the Pinewood scheme, using his political influence to facilitate the land grab that would benefit his major campaign contributor. Arrested David stood in his cabin that evening, looking out over the mountains that had once been the site of his worst nightmare. The satellite dish that had started his war with Margaret still sat on his roof, now a symbol of his victory over corruption and intimidation. His phone rang, and Agent Collins' voice carried news that made him smile for the first time in months. "David, I wanted you to hear this directly from me. The federal government has agreed to pay restitution to all victims of the Pinewood conspiracy. You'll be receiving compensation not just for your property damage and legal expenses, but for the emotional trauma you endured." But more importantly, David had found his purpose. The novel he'd planned to write about quiet mountain life had been replaced by something far more powerful, a true crime book about the corruption he'd helped expose. Publishers from New York were already calling. The final twist came 6 months later, when David received a letter in his mailbox. It was from Margaret Thornfield, written from federal prison. Inside was a simple message: "Mr. Chen, I know my apology means nothing after what I put you through, but I want you to know that seeing your courage to fight back, even when everything seemed hopeless, helped me find the courage to tell the truth. Thank you for saving our community from people like me." David folded the letter carefully and walked to his computer. He had a story to finish, one that would ensure that Margaret Thornfield's crimes and her ultimate redemption would never be forgotten. The quiet mountain cabin that had nearly been his downfall had become the fortress from which he'd helped bring justice to an entire state. And sometimes, David thought as he began typing, that's exactly the kind of ending a good story needs. If you enjoyed this incredible true story of corruption and justice, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Have you ever dealt with an abuse of horror or witnessed corruption in your community? Share your story in the comments below. You never know who might need to hear that they're not alone in fighting back against injustice.